In the American South of 1859, beauty was not admired, it was feared, especially when it lived inside the body of a black girl who could not be owned in spirit, no matter how tightly her wrists were chained. This is the story of Seraphina, a girl whose face became a prison, whose silence became a threat, and whose beauty terrified her mistress so deeply that she was hidden from the world for 10 years, alive, breathing, and slowly becoming something they could no longer control. In the year 1859, when the South measured human worth in land deeds and flesh, when silence was demanded and obedience mistaken for peace, Seraphina learned that beauty, when carried by a black girl, was not something to be admired, but something to be punished, because from the moment she reached womanhood, her presence unsettled the delicate order of the plantation, not through rebellion or defiance, but through existence alone, through the way her face held symmetry that made people pause mid-sentence, through the way her eyes absorbed the world with an intelligence that had never been taught yet somehow fully formed, and through the quiet dignity with which she moved, never rushed, never bowed her head too deeply, never shrinking herself enough to make others comfortable, and this unsettled her mistress more than any act of resistance ever could, because Seraphina did not need to speak to be noticed, did not need to ask questions to understand, and did not need permission to be seen. The mistress first felt it during social gatherings, when visiting women noticed Seraphina before the furniture, when men grew uncharacteristically silent in her presence, when compliments disguised as concern were directed not at her work, but at her appearance, and though Seraphina never responded, never smiled too long, never lingered where she was not told, the attention followed her like a shadow that refused to be dismissed. And slowly, subtly, jealousy took root not as anger but as fear, because the mistress began to sense that Seraphina represented something uncontrollable, something that could not be beaten out without leaving visible damage, something that threatened the illusion that beauty, intelligence, and power belonged only to whiteness. Seraphina was not merely beautiful, she was aware, and awareness in a slave was considered a sickness that could spread, and so the mistress watched her closely, counting glances, memorizing expressions, measuring the space between Seraphina and her husband, between Seraphina and guests, between Seraphina and the world, and each glance became a crime, each moment of stillness an accusation, until finally the mistress convinced herself that something had to be done, not publicly, not violently, but quietly, permanently, in a way that would remove the problem without explanation, because explanations invited questions, and questions invited truth. The decision was not made in rage, but in calculation. And one evening, when the house was heavy with silence, and the air carried the damp smell of old wood and unsaid things, Seraphina was called away from her duties and told to follow, and she did, because obedience had been trained into her bones, unaware that this walk would end her visible life. And as they moved through the unused corridors of the plantation's back wing, where rooms existed only to store what was no longer wanted, Seraphina felt the shift before she understood it, the way sound disappeared, the way light thinned, the way the walls seemed to close inward, and when the door opened to a narrow room with no windows, no furniture, no warmth, she did not scream, did not cry, did not beg, because instinct told her that reaction was what was desired, and denial was her only defense. But denial did not stop the iron, did not stop the cold bite of chains around her ankles, the weight settling into her wrists, the finality of metal designed not for movement, but containment, and as the door closed and the lock turned, the sound echoed louder than any gunshot she had ever heard, because it marked the moment Seraphina ceased to exist to the world above, sealed away not for something she had done, but for something she was. And in that darkness, as the echoes faded and the air grew still, Seraphina understood with terrifying clarity that her beauty had not made her valuable, her intelligence had not made her exceptional, and her silence had not protected her, because the true crime was not her presence, but the fear it inspired. And this was how her imprisonment began, not as punishment, but as erasure. And before this story continues deeper into the darkness that followed, subscribe to the Black Timeline. Hit the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next, and leave a comment telling us how this beginning made you feel, because Seraphina's story is not just about what was taken from her, it is about what survived when everything else was meant to disappear. The days that followed did not announce themselves with sunrise or sunset because Seraphina's world no longer obeyed time, and in the narrow room where she was held, the darkness had weight, pressing against her eyes until sight itself felt like a memory, and at first she counted seconds by her breath, slow and deliberate, because panic wasted air, and air was survival, and she learned quickly that the room was designed not to kill but to unmake, to dissolve a person without leaving a mark, because death would have required explanation, but disappearance could be folded quietly into routine, and so hours passed with only the sound of her chains shifting when she moved, the scrape of iron against stone reminding her that even the smallest adjustment came at a cost, and when food arrived it was slid through a narrow opening without a word, without eye contact, without acknowledgement that the hands receiving it were human, and this silence was more brutal than shouting, because silence told her she was not being punished, she was being forgotten on purpose. Yet Seraphina did not surrender to the darkness as they expected, because in the absence of light she learned to listen, to feel the vibrations of the house through the walls, to recognize footsteps by weight and rhythm, to map the plantation in her mind using sound alone, and this awareness became her rebellion, because while her body was confined, her mind continued to move freely, revisiting memories, stitching together moments from before the door closed, moments of overheard conversations, fragments of books read aloud in passing, lessons absorbed not through instruction but observation, and she realized that what frightened her mistress most was not beauty alone but memory, because Seraphina remembered everything, and memory in a slave was dangerous, and so she sharpened it, repeating names, dates, faces, storing them like hidden seeds, because even if she never left this room, the truth of what was happening existed inside her, and truth, once formed, did not require witnesses to remain real. Seasons changed without announcement, marked only by the temperature of the stone beneath her feet, the way cold crept into her bones in winter and damp heat clung to her skin in summer, and with each passing month her body weakened, but her will adapted, learning how to rest without lying down, how to stretch against chains without tearing skin, how to eat slowly so hunger would not return too quickly, and in this forced stillness she began to understand the plantation more clearly than those who walked freely within it, because distance stripped illusion, and she saw now that the mistress's cruelty was not madness but calculation, born from a terror of being replaced, a terror of being seen as ordinary in a world that promised her supremacy, and that realization did not comfort Seraphina, but it steadied her, because fear was predictable, and predictability could be endured. Sometimes, late at night, she heard the mistress pacing above her, restless foot, steps circling rooms filled with mirrors and fine furniture, and Seraphina imagined her reflection multiplying endlessly, trapped not by chains but by envy, and this thought gave her a quiet strength, because though her body was bound, her captor was imprisoned by her own insecurity, and that imbalance mattered. Even here, there were moments when despair crept in uninvited, when the silence grew so heavy it felt like it might crush her chest, when she wondered if the world had already adjusted to her absence, if her name had been erased from ledgers, if her face had faded from memory, and during those moments she allowed herself to grieve not just for freedom but for acknowledgement, because to suffer unseen was its own form of violence. But even then she refused to let grief hollow her out completely, choosing instead to anchor herself in small certainties, the rhythm of her heart, the warmth of her own breath, the knowledge that she was still thinking, still remembering, still herself, and this stubborn continuity became her survival, because the true goal of her confinement was not physical restraint but psychological collapse, and as long as she remained whole inside, the plan was incomplete. Whispers began to drift into her awareness through the walls, rumors carried unintentionally by servants who did not know they were being heard, hints that people had noticed her absence, that questions were being quietly asked and quietly dismissed, and though no one came to her door, the mere existence of curiosity unsettled the mistress, and Seraphina sensed a shift in the energy of the house, a tightening, a vigilance that suggested fear was growing on both sides of the lock, and this realization gave her something dangerous and precious, hope, not the naive hope of rescue, but the darker hope that truth had a way of pressing outward, even when buried. And as the years stretched forward, unmarked and relentless, Seraphina understood that survival itself was an act of defiance, that every breath she took contradicted the intention behind that locked door, and though she did not yet know how or when this captivity would end, she knew with certainty that it had not succeeded in its deepest aim, because the girl they sought to erase had not disappeared. She had transformed, becoming quieter, sharper, more patient, carrying within her a story that refused to die, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough to contain it. As the years pressed forward with the slow cruelty of water wearing down stone, Seraphina's isolation deepened into something almost ritualistic, as if the house itself had accepted her captivity as part of its hidden architecture, and the cellar where she was kept became less a room and more a boundary between worlds, a place where time behaved differently, stretching and folding in on itself, so that days blurred together and memory became the only reliable measure of existence. And yet even as her body thinned and her joints ached from the unchanging posture forced upon her, her mind grew more expansive, reaching beyond the walls that contained her, because the human spirit, when denied movement, learns to travel inward with terrifying clarity, and Seraphina began to notice how suffering refined perception, how silence sharpened thought, how pain, when endured rather than resisted, revealed patterns that others never saw. She understood now that her mistress's decision to lock her away had not been an impulsive act of rage, but a deliberate strategy born of fear. Fear not only of beauty but of contrast, because Seraphina's presence exposed the fragility of the social order the mistress relied upon, revealing that grace, intelligence, and dignity were not inherited privileges, but human traits that flourished even under bondage, and that truth was intolerable to a woman whose identity depended on believing otherwise. And so Seraphina became a secret rather than a spectacle, hidden not because she was vacant, but because she was too revealing. Above her, life continued with performative normalcy. Dinners, prayers, visitors who praised the household's order and civility, while beneath their feet a living contradiction breathed quietly in the dark, and Seraphina learned to listen not just for footsteps but for tone, for the emotional residue carried in voices that passed overhead, sensing when the mistress was anxious, when she was triumphant, when she was unraveling, because cruelty does not bring peace. It requires constant reinforcement, and each year that Seraphina remained alive intensified the mistress's unease, turning her vigilance into obsession, her authority into paranoia, and this imbalance created small fractures in the household's routine, cracks through which fragments of the outside world slipped into Seraphina's awareness. She learned of births and deaths, of economic worries whispered late at night, of political tensions creeping closer as the country itself began to strain against the moral weight of slavery, and though she could not see these changes, she felt them like shifts in pressure, understanding instinctively that the world beyond her cell was not static, that systems built on violence eventually trembled under their own contradictions, and this knowledge sustained her when her body threatened to fail, because it reminded her that her suffering was not isolated, that it existed within a larger, unstable structure already beginning to collapse. There were nights when dreams carried her back to sunlight, to fields and open air, but these dreams no longer brought comfort, because waking from them sharpened the pain of confinement, and so she trained herself to dream differently, not of escape but of endurance, imagining herself as something elemental and patient, a river-carving stone, a root-splitting foundation, slow forces that did not announce themselves yet changed landscapes over time, and this internal transformation marked a turning point, because Seraphina stopped waiting for rescue and began preparing for revelation, understanding that if she ever left this place, it would not be as the girl who vanished, but as the witness who returned. Her body bore the cost of this resolve, muscles stiffening, skin scarred by chains, breath sometimes shallow with exhaustion. Yet she treated these signs not as defeats but as evidence, proof etched into flesh that could not be denied if ever seen, and she committed each detail to memory, cataloguing the way suffering marked her, because memory, she knew, could be carried even when everything else was stripped away. Above her, the mistress's behavior grew increasingly erratic, her public composure fraying as years passed without the relief she had expected, because erasure had not delivered peace, and the secret she guarded so fiercely began to consume her, isolating her from allies, turning servants into potential threats. And in this way the roles subtly inverted, with Seraphina becoming the stable center of herself, while her captor spiraled, haunted by the knowledge that beneath her carefully maintained respectability lay an act so monstrous it could not survive daylight. And this inversion mattered, because power, Seraphina realized, was not merely the ability to command, but the ability to endure without surrendering one's humanity. And by that measure the chains had failed. Sometimes, during long nights when pain kept sleep at bay, Seraphina whispered her own name aloud, not because she feared forgetting it, but because she refused to let it exist only in silence, and the sound of her voice, echoing faintly against stone, reminded her that she was still present, still asserting herself in a space designed to negate her existence, and this small act became a quiet ritual of resistance, a way of insisting that even unseen lives leave traces. As the 10th year approached, though she did not yet know it, subtle changes began to ripple through the house. New servants, who asked questions too freely, visitors who noticed inconsistencies in the household's stories, moments when the mistress's authority faltered just long enough to reveal desperation beneath it. And Seraphina sensed this shift like a storm gathering beyond the horizon, understanding that secrets do not disappear, they accumulate weight, and eventually that weight demands release. And so she waited, not passively but attentively, gathering strength where she could, preserving clarity where despair threatened, because she knew now that survival alone was no longer the goal, that endurance had given her something rarer and more dangerous than beauty ever was, the power to testify, to exist as living proof of what had been done in the shadows. And as the air above her cell began to change, carrying with it the faint but unmistakable scent of reckoning, Seraphina prepared herself for the moment when darkness would no longer be able to contain the truth she carried, a truth forged in silence, sharpened by years of confinement, and ready at last to emerge. As the 10th year edged closer like a slow tide that could no longer be held back, the atmosphere within the house shifted in ways that were subtle to the untrained eye, yet unmistakable to someone who had learned to read silence as language. And Seraphina, confined beneath the floorboards, felt that change in the cadence of footsteps, in the nervous pauses that lingered before doors were opened, in the way conversations above her ended too abruptly, as if the walls themselves were listening, because secrets, once old enough, begin to rot, and rot announces itself through instability long before it is visible. The mistress, who had once carried her cruelty with cold certainty, now moved through the house like a woman haunted by her own reflection, startled by sudden noises, quick to anger, suspicious of glances that lingered too long. And this internal unraveling seeped downward into the cellar where Seraphina waited, not with hope exactly, but with a sharpened awareness that something irreversible was approaching. New servants had been hired, younger ones, less disciplined, less trained in the art of not seeing, and they moved differently, their curiosity less suppressed, their questions poorly hidden behind politeness, and though none of them knew what lay beneath their feet, they sensed the wrongness of the place, the way certain doors were never opened, the way the mistress's voice tightened whenever the cellar was mentioned, and this collective unease formed a kind of pressure that pressed inward on the secret until it could no longer remain contained. Seraphina listened as rumors drifted down through the floor like dust, fragments of conversations about neighbors whose households were being questioned, about inspectors and distant relatives who had begun asking after old property records, about changes in the political climate that made even the most powerful families uneasy, and she understood that the world outside was no longer as safe for secrets as it once had been, that the era which allowed cruelty to hide behind respectability was beginning, slowly and unevenly, to fracture. The mistress felt this too, and her attempts to reassert control grew more frantic, her routines more rigid, her punishments harsher for the enslaved people she could still command. As if cruelty might re-establish the boundaries she felt dissolving beneath her, but power exercised in fear has a different texture than power exercised in confidence, and those under her authority sensed it, responding not with obedience but with guarded distance, with eyes that looked away too quickly, with silences that no longer felt submissive but watchful. Below, Seraphina's body bore the cost of time with increasing clarity, joints stiff, muscles weakened, skin marked by years of restraint. Yet her mind remained alert, anchored by the knowledge that she had endured long enough to see the balance begin to tilt, and this realization altered her relationship with pain, transforming it from an enemy into a record, a ledger of years that could one day speak when words failed. There were moments when despair threatened to overtake her, when the sheer weight of lost time pressed so heavily that breathing felt like effort. But those moments passed more quickly now, because she had learned that despair thrives on uncertainty, and uncertainty was giving way to anticipation, a sense that whatever came next, whether release or ruin, would at least be movement, and movement after a decade of stillness was its own kind of mercy. Above her, the mistress began sleeping poorly, pacing at night, revisiting the cellar door more frequently, standing there in silence, as if listening for something she feared to hear, and in those moments Seraphina held her breath, not out of fear of discovery, but out of an instinctive understanding that the truth they shared, one imprisoned by her own actions, had reached a point where it could no longer remain unacknowledged, even in silence. The power dynamic that once seemed absolute had eroded invisibly over time, and though Seraphina remained physically confined, she sensed that the mistress was now the one trapped, bound by a decision made 10 years earlier that could not be undone, only exposed, and this inversion carried a quiet, unsettling symmetry, as if the universe itself were recalibrating a moral imbalance. The cellar, once a place of negation, began to feel like a chamber of preservation, a space where evidence had been kept intact precisely because it had been hidden, and Seraphina's survival took on a significance she had not anticipated, because by remaining alive she had denied the mistress the erasure she sought, transforming the act of confinement into a prolonged act of testimony. There were nights when Seraphina imagined the moment of emergence, not as a dramatic rescue but as a slow, disorienting return to light, a body weakened yet upright, a presence that could not be explained away, and she rehearsed this moment internally, steadying herself against the shock of it, reminding herself that truth, when revealed, often meets resistance before recognition, and that endurance did not guarantee justice, only the possibility of it. As whispers above grew more frequent and the mistress's control visibly frayed, Seraphina felt an unexpected calm settle over her, not because suffering had ended, but because its purpose had shifted. No longer an endless punishment, but a finite chapter nearing its conclusion, and this calm allowed her to conserve what strength remained, to prepare not for escape, but for confrontation with a world that had continued without her, a world that would need to be taught how to see her not as a myth or a scandal, but as a living consequence of cruelty hidden too long. The house itself seemed to respond to this tension, creaking more loudly, settling unevenly, as if the weight of the secret beneath it had begun to distort its foundations, and Seraphina understood then that confinement had not diminished her presence but concentrated it, turning her into a silent force exerting pressure on everything above. And as the days crept forward and the unseen storm gathered strength, she held fast to the knowledge that survival had given her something her captor could never reclaim, the authority of lived truth, and whatever lay ahead, whether liberation or further trial, would unfold within a world no longer able to pretend she did not exist, because the darkest secrets are not undone by forgetting, but by the moment they are finally brought into the light. By the time the season turned again, and the air above the cellar grew heavy with the promise of heat, the household had entered a phase where pretense could no longer fully conceal decay, and Seraphina sensed that the story of her confinement was beginning to press outward into the world, whether anyone willed it or not, because secret, held too tightly, eventually shaped the hands that clutched them, and the mistress's grip on her own carefully constructed reality had begun to slip in visible ways. Letters arrived more frequently now. Some read and reread until the paper softened at the creases, others burned immediately after opening, their ashes scattered with unnecessary haste, and Seraphina listened as fragments of their contents filtered downward, mentions of inquiries, of relatives arriving unannounced, of obligations that could no longer be postponed, and she understood that the mistress's isolation was no longer self-imposed, but enforced by circumstance, as the social web that once protected her thinned under scrutiny. The cellar door, which had once been visited only when necessity demanded cruelty, now became a place of anxious pilgrimage, the mistress standing before it at odd hours, as if measuring the distance between what she had done and what she could still control. And in those moments, Seraphina felt an odd, sober clarity, recognizing that power was no longer flowing in one direction, that her mere continued existence had become an unspoken negotiation, a fact the mistress could neither erase nor explain. The enslaved people who worked the house moved with new caution, their eyes flicking toward the cellar more often, their conversations dropping into silence when the mistress passed, and though none of them yet knew the truth, they sensed that something was wrong in a way that could no longer be dismissed as ordinary cruelty. And this collective intuition formed a quiet network of awareness that weakened the mistress's authority more effectively than open defiance ever could. Seraphina, meanwhile, found herself grappling with a new and unexpected challenge, not the endurance of suffering, which she had mastered, but the preparation for re-entry into a world that had not prepared itself to receive her, because survival in isolation had sharpened her inward strength while leaving her body fragile, and she understood that whatever came next would demand a different kind of resilience, one that balanced truth with caution, testimony with self-preservation. She rehearsed conversations in her mind, imagined questions she might be asked, practiced answering them with precision rather than emotion, because she knew that disbelief would be her first adversary, that the very extremity of her confinement would invite denial, and so she committed herself to remembering everything with exactness, the sequence of days, the patterns of visits, the sounds that marked the passage of time, transforming memory into structure, into something that could withstand scrutiny. Above her, the mistress's health began to falter, not dramatically but persistently, her sleep disrupted, her appetite unreliable, her temper frayed, and Seraphina recognized the familiar shape of a body buckling under sustained fear, because fear, when carried long enough, becomes a kind of internal erosion, wearing down even those who wield power, and this realization brought no satisfaction, only a sober acknowledgement that cruelty extracts a cost from all who participate in it, even if unevenly distributed. The house itself had become a theater of strained normalcy, hosting visitors with forced hospitality, presenting a facade of order that felt increasingly brittle, and during these visits, Seraphina listened closely, parsing accents and manners, gauging whether these outsiders were allies of silence or harbingers of exposure, because she understood now that her fate was no longer solely in the mistress's hands, but entangled in a broader convergence of forces beyond either of them. There were moments when the cellar felt less like a prison and more like a threshold, a place suspended between what had been done and what could no longer be prevented. And in this liminal space, Seraphina cultivated patience not as passivity, but as readiness, conserving energy, steadying her breath, aligning her, though, with the reality that movement, any movement, would require intention rather than impulse. The years of stillness had taught her that survival was not a single act, but a series of choices made repeatedly under constraint, and now, as the constraints began to shift, she prepared to choose again, aware that freedom, when it arrives after prolonged deprivation, can be disorienting, even dangerous, if not met with discernment. The mistress, sensing this shift, though unable to articulate it, oscillated between vigilance and avoidance, sometimes lingering near the cellar as if tempted to confirm that the past remained contained, at other times refusing to acknowledge its existence entirely, and this inconsistency created opportunities, moments when oversight lapsed, when routines broke, when the machinery of control stuttered, and Seraphina noted each one, not yet acting but learning the rhythm of collapse. She understood that exposure rarely comes as a single dramatic rupture, but as an accumulation of small failures that eventually align, and her role, whether chosen or imposed, was to remain intact long enough to be present when that alignment occurred. As days lengthened and the air grew thick with anticipation, Seraphina felt the weight of her own history pressing forward, no longer a burden she carried alone but a force demanding recognition, and she steadied herself for the moment when endurance would no longer be enough, when she would need to translate survival into speech, suffering into evidence, and memory into something the world could not easily dismiss, knowing that whatever happened next would not restore what had been taken, but would irrevocably alter the silence that had allowed it. And in that knowledge she found a quiet, resolute strength, the kind that does not announce itself but endures, waiting for the precise moment when truth can no longer be contained. As the fragile balance within the house continued to erode, the moment Seraphina had sensed for so long finally began to take shape, not as a single event, but as a convergence of pressures that could no longer be redirected, because the systems that had sustained her disappearance were failing simultaneously, and when multiple failures align, even the most carefully hidden truths are forced upward. It began with an unexpected arrival, a distant relative whose visit had not been planned far enough in advance to be managed, whose presence disrupted the carefully regulated rhythms of the household, bringing with it questions that were framed politely, yet carried an undercurrent of suspicion, questions about unused rooms, about locked doors, about records that no longer matched the physical reality of the estate, and the mistress, already strained beyond her capacity to improvise, responded with a defensiveness that only sharpened attention, rather than deflecting it. Seraphina listened as these exchanges unfolded above her, each word a tremor that traveled downward, confirming what she had long understood, that secrecy depends not on silence alone, but on consistency. And consistency had been broken. The cellar, once an absolute boundary, became a liability, its very existence an anomaly that demanded explanation, and the mistress's attempts to control access to it grew increasingly conspicuous, transforming a hidden space into a focal point of unease. The servants, too, felt this shift, their movements more hesitant, their glances more communicative, as if an unspoken agreement had formed among them that something was wrong in a way that could no longer be ignored, and though fear still restrained them, it no longer operated in isolation, because fear shared begins to change its nature, becoming something closer to resolve. Seraphina, sensing this collective awareness, experienced a complex layering of emotion, not hope exactly, but a heightened alertness, a readiness sharpened by years of waiting, and she focused on preserving her strength, regulating her breath, grow, unding herself in the physical reality of her body despite its weakness, because she knew that if the door opened, whether in rescue or confrontation, she would need to remain present, lucid, and undeniable. The mistress's behavior deteriorated further, marked by abrupt mood swings and moments of visible panic. And in one such moment, when her composure finally fractured in front of witnesses, the facade of control she had maintained for so long cracked irreparably, because authority that reveals fear invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites discovery. It was during this period that the cellar door was opened more frequently, sometimes checked hastily, sometimes lingered over, and each opening brought a rush of unfamiliar air that reminded Seraphina of the world beyond, of scale and distance and possibility, and though she did not yet act, she prepared herself mentally for the shock of exposure, rehearsing stillness, rehearsing speech, rehearsing the act of standing after so long constrained, because freedom, she understood, is not merely the absence of chains, but the ability to occupy space without apology. The turning point came not with violence or spectacle, but with inevitability, when the mistress's authority was finally superseded by external oversight, by men whose presence signaled that private power had reached its limit, and as they moved through the house conducting their inquiries, the cellar could no longer be excluded without explanation, and explanation was no longer possible. Seraphina heard the approach before she saw it, the unfamiliar cadence of boots, the measured voices that spoke not in commands, but in assessments, and when the door was finally opened fully, light flooded the space with an intensity that was almost unbearable, revealing not only her physical form, but the undeniable evidence of prolonged confinement etched into her body. And in that moment, silence ceased to be an option for anyone present. The reaction was not immediate comprehension, but stunned disbelief, followed by a dawning recognition that something profoundly wrong had been sustained in secret for a decade, and Seraphina, though weakened, met their gaze with a steadiness born of endurance, understanding that this was the moment she had prepared for, the moment when her existence itself constituted testimony. The mistress's collapse was swift and unceremonious, her authority dissolving under the weight of exposure, and as she was led away, Seraphina felt no triumph, only a deep grounding relief that the truth no longer depended solely on her survival, that it had finally entered the world, where it could not be contained by a single will. Yet even as she was guided upward, her movements tentative, her senses overwhelmed by light and sound, Seraphina understood that this was not an ending but a transition, that the years ahead would bring their own trials, skepticism, judgment, the slow work of reclaiming a life interrupted. But she also understood that the most isolating chapter was over, because isolation thrives in secrecy, and secrecy had been broken. As she crossed the threshold from cellar to house, from hidden to seen, she carried with her not only the memory of what had been done, but the quiet authority of having endured it without surrendering her sense of self. And though the world above felt vast and uncertain, it was no longer inaccessible, and in that first unsteady step into visibility, Seraphina claimed something that had never truly been taken from her, the right to exist openly, to be acknowledged as a person whose suffering mattered, and whose survival had transformed silence into an irrevocable truth. In the days that followed her emergence from the cellar, Seraphina existed in a strange suspension between worlds, neither fully reclaimed by the life that had once known her, nor yet integrated into the one now forced to acknowledge her. And this liminal state carried its own quiet violence, because visibility does not immediately translate into understanding, and truth, once exposed, must still fight to be believed. She was moved carefully, almost reverently at first, as if her fragility rendered her sacred, yet beneath that surface caution lay an undercurrent of uncertainty, of people unsure how to situate her within their moral frameworks, because her survival disrupted more than a household secret. It unsettled the comfortable distance between cruelty and accountability that many had relied upon, and as she was examined, questioned, observed, Seraphina became acutely aware that endurance had not ended with rescue, but merely changed its form. Her body, weakened by years of confinement, demanded patience from those around her, and yet patience was a resource not everyone possessed, because institutions move slowly and unevenly, and sympathy often erodes when it demands sustained attention rather than momentary outrage. She answered questions with care, measuring each response not out of fear but precision, understanding that the weight of her testimony lay not in dramatic language but in consistency, in the quiet accumulation of detail that resisted dismissal. And though the process was exhausting, she persisted, because silence had been imposed upon her long enough, and speech, even when met with skepticism, was now an assertion of presence she refused to relinquish. The mistress's fate unfolded separately, discussed in hushed tones and formal proceedings that Seraphina did not attend, and this distance allowed her to avoid the spectacle of punishment that might have falsely suggested resolution, because no consequence could restore lost years, and Seraphina felt no need to witness a reckoning that could never balance what had been done. Instead, her focus turned inward and forward, toward the difficult work of re-inhabiting a body and mind shaped by isolation, toward learning again the rhythms of ordinary existence, light without shock, sound without alarm, human proximity without threat. And this process was neither linear nor gentle, because trauma does not dissolve upon exposure but reasserts itself unpredictably in moments of quiet as often as crisis, she found herself startled by kindness, unsettled by open spaces, fatigued by conversation, and these responses confused those who expected gratitude to manifest as ease. Yet Seraphina understood that recovery was not performance but adaptation, and she allowed herself the time she had been denied, insisting, when necessary, on boundaries that honored the reality of what she had endured. Stories about her began to circulate, altered and embellished, as they moved beyond her control, some casting her as a symbol, others as a curiosity. And while she recognized the inevitability of narrative distortion, she remained grounded in the knowledge that her truth did not require unanimous agreement to remain valid, because it was anchored in lived experience rather than interpretation. The enslaved community, learning gradually of her survival, responded with a mixture of awe and grief, seeing in her both a testament to resilience and a reminder of the countless others whose suffering had not been interrupted in time, and Seraphina felt this collective weight keenly, understanding that her story was singular yet inseparable from a broader history of silenced lives, and this awareness shaped her sense of responsibility, not as obligation but as connection. She did not speak often of justice in the conventional sense, because justice, as she had learned, was rarely proportionate to harm, but she spoke instead of acknowledgement, of the necessity of naming what had been hidden so that it could no longer replicate itself in secrecy. And in doing so she began to shift from subject to witness, from evidence to voice, reclaiming agency in a world that had long denied it. There were nights when memories resurfaced with sudden clarity, when the darkness of her former cell seemed to press inward despite the opens of her surroundings, and in those moments she returned to the practices that had sustained her: controlled breath, deliberate thought, the quiet repetition of her name, not as coping mechanisms imposed by circumstance, but as tools she had forged herself. And this continuity reminded her that survival had not erased her identity but refined it. As time passed, the initial shock of her discovery faded from public attention, replaced by new concerns and distractions, yet Seraphina remained, living proof that the past does not remain past simply because attention shifts. And in this persistence she found a quiet power, because endurance, when sustained beyond spectacle, becomes a form of resistance. She began to imagine a future not defined solely by what had been taken, but by what could still be shaped. A future where her story might serve not as an anomaly, but as a warning, a reminder of what secrecy enables and what exposure demands. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, marked by limitations imposed both externally and internally, she moved forward with a steadiness earned through suffering, carrying with her the understanding that survival is not merely the act of continuing to exist, but the insistence on being seen as fully human. And in claiming that recognition for herself, Seraphina quietly expanded its possibility for others, transforming her long confinement into a force that would outlast the walls that once contained her. As Seraphina moved further from the moment of her discovery and deeper into the slow, uneven work of living again, she began to understand that survival was not a single victory, but a lifelong negotiation with memory, expectation, and the world's tendency to simplify what it cannot comfortably hold. And this understanding reshaped how she carried her story forward, because she no longer felt compelled to prove the depth of her suffering to those unwilling to grasp it, choosing instead to root herself in the quiet certainty of what she knew to be true. Days settled into routines that were modest yet meaningful, learning how to walk longer distances without exhaustion, how to sleep through the night without jolting awake, how to sit in sunlight without feeling exposed. And though each small gain was accompanied by moments of setback, Seraphina treated progress not as a straight line but as a widening circle, one that allowed space for both strength and vulnerability to coexist. The world around her continued to move on, as it always does, but traces of her story lingered in conversations, in glances that held curiosity or discomfort, in institutions that referenced her case as an anomaly rather than a symptom. And while this reduction frustrated her, she resisted the urge to correct every misunderstanding, recognizing that the labor of education must be chosen carefully if it is not to become another form of confinement. Instead, she focused on what she could control: the preservation of her own narrative in its truest form, the cultivation of relationships grounded in respect rather than fascination, and the steady reclaiming of agency over her body and time, which had once been denied so completely. She found meaning in listening to others whose stories had never been recorded, recognizing in their silences the same pressures that had once surrounded her, and in these exchanges she sensed a shared resilience that did not erase pain, but transformed it into something connective, something capable of challenging isolation wherever it appeared. Years later, when the details of her confinement had faded from public memory, and her name was no longer spoken with the same intensity, Seraphina understood that this fading did not diminish the significance of what she had endured, because impact is not always measured by attention, but by the subtle shifts it produces. Questions asked more carefully, doors left open rather than sealed, assumptions unsettled rather than accepted. She lived long enough to see the house that once concealed her secret change hands, its cellar repurposed, its walls stripped of authority, and though she did not return there, she carried with her the knowledge that places do not retain power without consent, that even the most oppressive spaces are temporary when confronted by truth. In reflecting on her life, Seraphina did not define herself solely by the decade she lost, but she did not deny it either, holding her past as one holds fire, acknowledging its danger, its pain, and its capacity to illuminate, because forgetting had never been an option, and remembrance, when chosen freely, became an act of autonomy rather than obligation. Her story, when told, served not as a spectacle of cruelty, but as a testament to endurance, a reminder that systems built on secrecy depend on the erasure of individual lives, and that resistance sometimes takes the form not of escape, but of remaining, breathing, remembering, until silence itself collapses under the weight of an undeniable presence. And as you reflect on Seraphina's journey, from a girl hidden away out of fear to a woman who emerged carrying truth forged in darkness, remember that these stories matter not because they are shocking, but because they reveal how easily humanity can be denied, and how powerfully it can be reclaimed. If this story moved you, challenged you, or stayed with you longer than you expected, take a moment to subscribe to the Black Timeline, hit the bell icon so you never miss another untold chapter of history, and leave a comment sharing how deeply this story affected you, because every voice that remembers helps ensure that what was once buried is never silenced again.